Chapter 2 of Smoke by Ivan Turgenev. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. A few paces from the Russian tree, at a little table in front of Weber's coffee house, there was sitting a good-looking man, about 30, of medium height, thin and dark, with a manly and pleasant face. He sat bending forward with both arms leaning on his stick, with the calm and simple air of a man to whom the idea had not occurred that any one would notice him or pay any attention to him. His large expressive golden brown eyes were gazing deliberately about him, sometimes screwed up to keep the sunshine out of them, and then watching fixedly some eccentric figure that passed by him while a childlike smile faintly stirred his fine moustache and lips, and his prominent short chin. He wore a roomy coat of German cut, and a soft grey hat hid half of his high forehead. At the first glance he made the impression of an honest, sensible, rather confident young man, such as there are many in the world. He seemed to be resting from prolonged labours and to be deriving all the more simple-minded amusement from the scene spread out before him because his thoughts were far away, and because they moved, too, those thoughts, in a world utterly unlike that which surrounded him at the moment. He was a Russian. His name was Grigory Mikhailovitch Litvinov. We have to make his acquaintance, and so it will be well to relate in a few words his past, which presents little of much interest or complexity. He was the son of an honest retired official of plebeian extraction, but he was educated, not as one would naturally expect, in the town, but in the country. His mother was of noble family, and had been educated in a government school. She was a good-natured and very enthusiastic creature, not devoid of character, however. Though she was 20 years younger than her husband, she remodelled him, as far as she could, drew him out of the petty official groove into the landowner's way of life, and softened and refined his harsh and stubborn character. Thanks to her, he began to dress with neatness, and to behave with decorum. He came to respect learned men and learning, though of course he never took a single book in his hand. He gave up swearing, and tried in every way not to demean himself. He even arrived at walking more quietly and speaking in a subdued voice, mostly of elevated subjects, which cost him no small effort. "Ah, they ought to be flogged, and that's all about it," he sometimes thought to himself, but aloud he pronounced, "Yes, that's so, of course. It is a great question." Litvinov's mother set her household, too, upon a European footing. She addressed the servants by the plural you instead of the familiar thou, and never allowed any one to gorge himself into a state of lethargy at her table. As regards the property belonging to her, neither she nor her husband was capable of looking after it at all. It had been long allowed to run to waste, but there was plenty of land, with all sorts of useful appurtenances, forest lands and a lake, on which there had once stood a factory, which had been founded by a zealous but unsystematic owner, and had flourished in the hands of a scoundrelly merchant, and gone utterly to ruin under the superintendence of a conscientious German manager. Madame Litvinov was contented so long as she did not dissipate her fortune or contract debts. Unluckily, she could not boast of good health, and she died of consumption in the very year that her son entered the Moscow University. He did not complete his course there, owing to circumstances of which the reader will hear more later on, and went back to his provincial home, where he idled away some time, without work and without ties, almost without acquaintances. Thanks to the disinclination for active service of the local gentry, who were, however, not so much penetrated by the Western theory of the evils of absenteeism, as by the home-grown conviction that one's own shirt is the nearest to one's skin. He was drawn for military service in 1855, and almost died of typhus in the Crimea, where he spent 6 months in a mud hut on the shore of the putrid sea, without ever seeing a single ally. After that, he served, not of course without unpleasant experiences, on the councils of the nobility, and after being a little time in the country, acquired a passion for farming. He realized that his mother's property, under the indolent and feeble management of his infirm old father, did not yield a tenth of the revenue it might yield, and that in experienced and skilful hands it might be converted into a perfect gold mine. But he realized, too, that experience and skill were just what he lacked, and he went abroad to study agriculture and technology, to learn them from the first rudiments. More than 4 years he had spent in Mecklenburg, in Silesia, and in Karlsruhe, and he had travelled in Belgium and in England. He had worked conscientiously and accumulated information. He had not acquired it easily, but he had persevered through his difficulties to the end, and now with confidence in himself, in his future, and in his usefulness to his neighbours, perhaps even to the whole countryside, he was preparing to return home, where he was summoned with despairing prayers and entreaties in every letter from his father, now completely bewildered by the emancipation, the redivision of lands, and the terms of redemption, by the new régime in short. But why was he in Baden? Well, he was in Baden because he was from day to day expecting the arrival there of his cousin and betrothed, Tatiana Petrovna Shestov. He had known her almost from childhood, and had spent the spring and summer with her at Dresden, where she was living with her aunt. He felt sincere love and profound respect for his young kinswoman, and on the conclusion of his dull preparatory labours, when he was preparing to enter on a new field, to begin real, unofficial duties, he proposed to her as a woman dearly loved, a comrade and a friend, to unite her life with his, for happiness and for sorrow, for labour and for rest, for better, for worse, as the English say. She had consented, and he had returned to Karlsruhe, where his books, papers and properties had been left. But why was he at Baden, you ask again? Well, he was at Baden because Tatyana's aunt, who had brought her up, Kapitolina Markovna Shestov, an old unmarried lady of 55, a most good-natured, honest, eccentric soul, a free thinker, all aglow with the fire of self-sacrifice and abnegation, an esprit fort (she read Strauss, it is true she concealed the fact from her niece), and a democrat, sworn opponent of aristocracy and fashionable society, could not resist the temptation of gazing for once on this aristocratic society in such a fashionable place as Baden. Kapitolina Markovna wore no crinoline and had her white hair cut in a round crop, but luxury and splendour had a secret fascination for her, and it was her favourite pastime to rail at them and express her contempt of them. How could one refuse to gratify the good old lady? But Litvinov was so quiet and simple, he gazed so self-confidently about him, because his life lay so clearly mapped out before him, because his career was defined, and because he was proud of this career, and rejoiced in it as the work of his own hands. End of chapter 2